What if I told you that doctors have discovered a single emotion that can age your brain 32% faster after 65? An emotion that millions of seniors experience daily without realizing it's silently destroying their memory. And what if I told you that this damage can be reversed in as little as 6 weeks using a simple 3-minute daily technique that costs nothing? Today, I'm going to reveal this hidden brain destroyer that's more damaging than high blood pressure, more dangerous than high cholesterol, and affects twice as many seniors as diabetes. You'll discover not only what this emotion is, but exactly how 3 ordinary seniors use surprising methods to reverse its damage and regain cognitive abilities their doctors thought were permanently lost. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon that had filled this space every Christmas for decades. The recipe card for her grandmother's ginger cookies lay on the counter, dog-eared and stained from 40 years of use. Her son David watched from the doorway as Eleanor stared at the ingredients, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I've made these cookies every December since before you were born." She picked up the measuring cup, then set it down again. "But now I can't remember. Is it 1 cup of sugar or 2? Do I cream the butter first or mix the dry ingredients?" Her voice broke. "What's happening to me, David?" David had noticed his mother's gradual changes over the past year. The forgotten appointments, repeated questions, misplaced keys. But watching her unable to follow a recipe she'd made hundreds of times sent him into a panic. The next morning, he drove Eleanor to a neurologist, certain they would receive a devastating diagnosis. What happened next surprised them both. After extensive testing, the neurologist explained that Eleanor wasn't showing the typical patterns of Alzheimer's disease. Instead, he'd identified something altogether different, a single emotional state that was actively accelerating her brain's aging process, damaging neural pathways, and mimicking dementia symptoms. Even more surprising, this emotional state was potentially reversible. "If what I'm seeing is correct," he told them, "we may be able to restore much of your cognitive function within months." What was this emotion that had aged Eleanor's brain by the equivalent of an extra decade? And why does it affect so many adults after 65, often without them even realizing it? Stay with me, because what Eleanor discovered could change everything you thought you knew about protecting your brain as you age. And if you're new here, we post new videos daily with life-changing information for seniors. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Now, let's uncover the emotion that might be silently damaging your brain. The hidden emotion, chronic anticipatory fear. The emotion that silently accelerated Eleanor's cognitive decline wasn't depression or stress as most people understand them. It was something researchers now identify as chronic anticipatory fear, a persistent state of fearfully anticipating future losses, dangers, or declines. This isn't the kind of fear that makes your heart race when you hear a strange noise at night. It's subtler, a constant background hum of worry about what might happen. For Eleanor, it began after she slipped in her bathroom 2 years earlier. Though she hadn't been seriously injured, the fall triggered something profound. She began constantly anticipating disaster. What if she fell again when no one was home? What if she couldn't remember which medications to take? What if she became a burden to David? "I started checking and rechecking everything," Eleanor later explained. "I'd check the stove 5 times before leaving the house. I'd rehearse in my mind all the things that might go wrong when I drove to the store. I was always waiting for something terrible to happen." What Eleanor didn't realize was that this constant state of anticipatory fear was flooding her brain with stress chemicals that are particularly damaging to memory centers in older adults. Each worried thought, each fearful anticipation, each mental rehearsal of potential problems was eroding her cognitive function in measurable ways. You might recognize this emotion in yourself or someone you love. It often disguises itself as prudence or wisdom. "I better not try that, I might fall. I shouldn't go there, something might happen. I can't learn that, my brain isn't what it used to be." These thoughts seem reasonable, even sensible. But neurologically, they create a state that literally accelerates brain aging. A neuroscientist specializing in emotional states and aging explains it this way: When the brain exists in a state of persistent anticipatory fear, it maintains elevated levels of cortisol and inflammatory factors that are especially toxic to the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, exactly the brain regions most vulnerable as we age. What makes this particularly dangerous is how common it becomes after 65. Studies suggest that up to 43% of older adults experience chronic anticipatory fear, yet few recognize it for what it is. Instead, they, and often their doctors, attribute their increasing forgetfulness, confusion, or mental slowdown to normal aging, rather than an emotional state that could potentially be addressed. For Eleanor, recognizing this pattern was the first step toward recovery. But before we explore how she reversed this process, let's look at how differently this same emotion manifested for Richard, whose story reveals just how deceptive anticipatory fear can be. Richard's story: the professor who couldn't remember. Richard Morgan's home office was his sanctuary, walls lined with books collected over 40 years as a history professor, his desk positioned perfectly beneath the window overlooking the university quad where he'd taught generations of students. At 73, he'd been retired for 8 years but still worked on his research and writing most mornings. Or at least, he had until recently. When I first met Richard, he was sitting in that office, staring at his computer screen, a half-written paragraph blinking back at him. "I've read the same 3 books 6 times trying to confirm this single historical detail," he told me. "But I can't seem to hold the information in my mind long enough to write it down. It's like trying to catch smoke." Richard's wife Dorothy had noticed other changes. He'd stopped attending his monthly lunch with former colleagues. He'd abandoned the memoir he'd been writing. Most telling, he'd begun checking and rechecking simple things, whether he'd locked the door, turned off the coffee pot, taken his medications. "I've always been careful," Richard explained, "but now I find myself constantly worried about making mistakes. What if I misquote a source in my writing? What if I forget something important? What if my colleagues notice I'm slipping?" Unlike Eleanor, Richard didn't have any dramatic incident that triggered his anticipatory fear. It crept in gradually, as he noticed small, age-related memory changes and began catastrophizing them. Each small lapse became evidence in his mind that something terrible was happening. And ironically, this fear about cognitive decline was actually accelerating the very process he feared most. When Richard finally saw a cognitive specialist, his neuropsychological testing showed an unusual pattern. His overall intelligence remained exceptionally high. His language skills were intact, but his working memory and processing speed had declined significantly more than expected for his age, exactly the cognitive domains most vulnerable to chronic stress chemistry. "What's happening in your brain, Richard," his doctor explained, "is like constantly driving a car with 1 foot on the gas and 1 foot on the brake. Your anticipatory fear is activating stress pathways that directly interfere with memory formation and retrieval." The brain scan revealed something even more concrete. Richard's hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure crucial for memory formation, showed signs of accelerated atrophy, with patterns distinct from both normal aging and Alzheimer's disease. The pattern was consistent with chronic stress exposure. What happened next would transform not just Richard's cognitive function, but his entire approach to his remaining years. But before I share that breakthrough, you need to understand exactly how this emotion damages your brain at a biological level, because knowing this mechanism is crucial to protecting yourself. How anticipatory fear physically damages your brain. When your brain experiences persistent anticipatory fear after 65, 3 critical processes occur that directly accelerate cognitive aging. Understanding these processes is essential because they explain why this particular emotional state is so damaging to the older brain. First, anticipatory fear creates prolonged elevation of cortisol, your primary stress hormone. While younger brains can generally tolerate elevated cortisol without significant damage, after 65, the brain's hippocampus becomes increasingly vulnerable to this hormone. Prolonged exposure literally causes hippocampal neurons to retract their branches, reducing connections with other neurons and impairing memory formation. Second, anticipatory fear triggers chronic low-grade inflammation in the brain, what neurologists call neuroinflammation. This inflammatory state is particularly damaging to white matter, the communication highways that connect different brain regions. As these connections deteriorate, information processing slows, multitasking becomes more difficult, and recall grows more effortful. Third, and perhaps most concerning, chronic anticipatory fear reduces production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, essentially fertilizer for brain cells. After 65, BDNF production naturally decreases somewhat, but persistent fear states can reduce it by an additional 30 to 50%, significantly impacting the brain's ability to maintain and form new neural connections. For Margaret Wilson, these biological processes manifested in unexpected ways that threatened to rob her of her greatest joy. At 69, Margaret's sprawling garden was her pride and connection to her late husband Thomas. He had designed the original layout 20 years earlier, and after his death, she had maintained and expanded it, creating a sanctuary of flowering shrubs, perennial borders, and carefully tended vegetables. Neighbors often stopped to admire it, and Margaret hosted the garden club meetings every spring. When her friend Elaine was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, something shifted in Margaret. Though she showed no cognitive symptoms herself, she began watching for them constantly. Every time I misplaced my gardening shears or forgot the name of a plant variety, I'd think, "This is how it starts," she told me. I'd wake up at night mentally inventorying every memory lapse from the previous day. Within 6 months, Margaret noticed she was having trouble remembering the names of plants she'd grown for years. She struggled to recall which seedlings she'd already planted. She found herself staring at her garden journal, unable to make sense of her own notes from previous seasons. Terrified, Margaret gradually withdrew from her garden club, embarrassed about her increasingly frequent memory lapses. She stopped inviting friends over for tea in the garden. She began making excuses to avoid conversations with neighbors, afraid they would notice changes in her mental sharpness. What Margaret didn't realize was that her anticipatory fear about cognitive decline was creating a neurobiological environment that was directly damaging her memory centers. Each worried thought, each mental rehearsal of a feared future with dementia, each night spent cataloging potential symptoms was triggering the exact processes that compromise cognitive function. "It's a cruel irony," explains a leading neurologist specializing in cognitive health. The intense fear of cognitive decline creates precisely the neurochemical conditions that accelerate it. We see this pattern repeatedly in older adults who are otherwise doing everything right: good diet, regular exercise, cognitive stimulation, but their anticipatory fear undermines these positive factors. This was certainly true for Margaret. Despite her physically active lifestyle, healthy Mediterranean diet, and cognitively stimulating hobbies, her memory continued to decline at an accelerated rate. 6 months after her first noticeable symptoms, she was referred to a memory clinic, where her neurologist identified the pattern of fear-driven cognitive changes. What happened next in Margaret's garden would provide one of the most powerful insights into how this damaging emotion can be counteracted. But before I share that breakthrough, let's see what Richard discovered that not only halted his cognitive decline but actually reversed many of his symptoms, because his solution might surprise you. And if you're finding these insights valuable, please comment below to let me know you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications. Your subscription ensures you won't miss any of our daily uploads in aging well and living your best life after 60. Now, let's continue with Richard's breakthrough. The unexpected solution Richard discovered. Richard sat across from his cognitive specialist, absorbing the news that his accelerating memory problems were largely driven by anticipatory fear rather than a progressive neurological disease. "So what now?" he asked. "Meditation? Medication? Some kind of therapy?" The doctor's answer surprised him. "Those might help," she said, "but I want you to join the university's volunteer teaching program for underprivileged high school students first. 3 afternoons a week." Richard was baffled. How will teaching teenagers help my memory problems? What his doctor understood, and research now confirms, is that meaningful social engagement focused on helping others creates a powerful neurochemical environment that directly counters the damaging effects of anticipatory fear. This isn't just positive thinking or distraction. It fundamentally changes how the brain processes fear and stress. Initially skeptical, Richard nonetheless agreed to volunteer. The program paired him with advanced high school students who couldn't afford college preparation. His role was to teach critical thinking through historical analysis, something he'd done professionally for decades. The first few sessions were uncomfortable. Richard worried constantly about forgetting names, losing his train of thought, or being unable to answer questions. But something unexpected began happening during his third week teaching. As one student struggled with analyzing primary sources, Richard became completely absorbed in guiding her approach. For those moments, his anticipatory fear simply vanished. I realized I'd gone 2 hours without a single thought about my own cognitive state, Richard told me later. For the first time in months, my mind wasn't monitoring itself for failures. This shift from self-focused worry to external engagement triggered profound neurobiological changes. When attention moves outward to help others, the brain's fear centers naturally downregulate. Stress hormones decrease. Inflammatory factors reduce. And perhaps most importantly, the brain releases neurochemicals that promote cognitive resilience, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. Within 2 months of regular teaching, Richard noticed he could again hold complex information in mind while writing. His sleep improved dramatically. His wife observed he'd stopped the constant checking behaviors. Formal cognitive testing 3 months later showed significant improvements in exactly the domains that had been declining: working memory and processing speed. What's remarkable about this approach, explains a neuroscientist and psychology professor, is that it doesn't just halt the damage from anticipatory fear, it creates a brain environment where actual cognitive recovery becomes possible. The science behind this effect is compelling. A landmark study found that older adults engaged in regular volunteer teaching showed significant reduction in cognitive decline over a 5-year period compared to non-volunteers. The protection was particularly pronounced for those who had previously shown higher levels of anticipatory fear. Richard's experience illustrates why this works. When I'm teaching, I can't simultaneously ruminate on my fears. The students need my full attention. And gradually, I realized those feared cognitive catastrophes I'd been anticipating simply weren't happening. I wasn't forgetting things during class. I could still think on my feet. I still had valuable knowledge to share. This doesn't mean Richard's anticipatory fear disappeared entirely. Rather, the regular experience of competence and purpose gradually rewired his anticipatory circuits. He began anticipating connection and contribution rather than failure and decline. Each positive teaching experience created evidence that countered his catastrophic expectations, slowly shifting his emotional baseline. While Richard's story demonstrates one powerful approach to counteracting anticipatory fear, Margaret's garden revelation would uncover another crucial aspect of protection, one that you can begin implementing today, regardless of your circumstances or cognitive status. Margaret's garden revelation. On a warm spring morning, 6 weeks after her diagnosis of fear-driven cognitive decline, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, gazing sadly at her garden. Once her pride and joy, it now filled her with anxiety and reminded her of mounting memory lapses. Plants needed dividing, weeds were encroaching, and she couldn't remember which varieties were planted where. Her neurologist had explained how anticipatory fear was affecting her brain and had recommended a specific protocol to counter its effects. But Margaret had been hesitant, unconvinced that something as intangible as an emotional state could so profoundly affect her memory. That morning, something unexpected happened. Her next-door neighbor's granddaughter, 8-year-old Sophie, appeared at the garden gate. "Grandma says your flowers are the prettiest on the block," Sophie called out. "Can you show me how to grow some?" Margaret hesitated. Her first thought was fear. What if she couldn't remember plant names? What if she became confused while explaining gardening techniques? But something about the little girl's eagerness cut through her anxiety. "Just for a few minutes," Margaret told herself, opening the back door. Those few minutes turned into an hour as Sophie's curiosity drew Margaret deeper into the garden. To her surprise, as she began explaining the difference between annuals and perennials, knowledge she feared lost came flowing back. When she couldn't remember the name of a particular daylily variety, she simply said, "That one slipped my mind, but look at how the petals curl back like this," demonstrating with her fingers. What happened in Margaret's brain during this interaction reveals another powerful protection against anticipatory fear. When she shifted from self-focused worry to present-moment engagement, her brain's default mode network, which governs rumination and self-referential thinking, naturally quieted. This allowed her medial temporal lobe, critical for memory access, to function more efficiently. More importantly, this simple garden interaction activated what neuroscientists call embodied cognition, the way physical movement and sensory engagement support cognitive function. As Margaret demonstrated gardening techniques, her procedural memory systems activated, bypassing the declarative memory systems that anticipatory fear had compromised. I realized I was remembering through my hands, Margaret explained later. Even when I couldn't recall the names of things, my body remembered how to care for them. This experience led Margaret to create a structured approach to countering her anticipatory fear. 3 mornings weekly, she invited Sophie and eventually other neighborhood children to what they called garden school. Rather than worrying about what she might forget, Margaret focused on sharing what she did remember. When memory gaps occurred, she treated them matter-of-factly. That name escapes me right now, but here's what matters about how to care for it. The neurological impact was profound. By regularly engaging in teaching activities that combined physical movement, sensory experience, and social connection, Margaret created a brain environment that directly countered the damaging effects of anticipatory fear. Her cognitive testing 4 months later showed significant improvements in both verbal recall and executive function. What we're seeing in cases like Margaret's, explains her doctor, is evidence that when older adults engage in multimodal activities that combine physical movement, teaching, and present-focused attention, they create a neurochemical environment that directly protects against fear-driven brain aging. The children benefited too. They learned gardening skills from an experienced mentor, while Margaret received the cognitive protection that comes from meaningful intergenerational connection. The children don't care if I can't remember the Latin name for every plant, Margaret noted. They care that I can show them how to make things grow. Margaret's garden revelation highlights a key protection strategy available to anyone, regardless of health status or circumstances. Find ways to physically engage in sharing knowledge or skills you still possess, focusing on present moment experience rather than worrying about what you might forget. Now let's return to Eleanor, whose remarkable recovery began with a simple 3-minute daily practice that you can start using today. The 3-minute protection protocol Eleanor used. When Eleanor learned that chronic anticipatory fear was accelerating her cognitive decline, she was simultaneously relieved and skeptical. Relieved that she didn't have Alzheimer's disease as she had feared, but skeptical that an emotional state could so dramatically affect her memory and thinking. I can't just stop worrying, she told her doctor during a follow-up appointment. I've tried that. The fears keep coming back. We're not going to try to eliminate the fears, the doctor explained. We're going to change how your brain processes them. He then introduced Eleanor to a specific 3-minute protocol designed to interrupt the neurological impact of anticipatory fear. The approach was remarkably simple. 3 times daily, Eleanor would practice what neuroscientists call limbic calming with cognitive anchoring. The process involves 3 steps, each taking approximately 1 minute. First, Eleanor would place one hand on her chest and take 5 slow breaths, exhaling for twice as long as she inhaled. This simple breathing pattern directly signals the vagus nerve to dampen the stress response and reduce cortisol production. Second, she would mentally name 5 things she could see, 4 things she could touch, 3 things she could hear, 2 things she could smell, and 1 thing she could taste. This sensory grounding technique shifts brain activity from the amygdala, fear center, to the sensory cortex, interrupting rumination. Third, and most importantly, Eleanor would complete the phrase, "Right now, I can still," with different answers each time. Right now, I can still enjoy the taste of my morning coffee. Right now, I can still recognize my daughter's voice on the phone. Right now, I can still remember the words to my favorite song. This final step is particularly powerful because it redirects the brain's anticipatory circuitry from negative future possibilities toward present capabilities. Research shows this simple redirection measurably reduces inflammatory markers in the hippocampus within hours of practice. The 3-minute protocol isn't about positive thinking or denying real concerns, explains the doctor. It's about giving your brain regular, brief breaks from the stress chemistry of anticipatory fear. These short interventions have a cumulative effect on brain resilience. Eleanor was diligent about practicing, using her phone's alarm as a reminder. The first changes she noticed weren't cognitive but emotional. She felt less anxious throughout the day. Sleep came more easily. Within 3 weeks, however, more significant changes emerged. She could follow recipes again. She remembered where she'd placed her keys. Conversations became easier to track. After 6 weeks of consistent practice combined with other lifestyle recommendations, Eleanor's cognitive testing showed remarkable improvements. Her memory scores had increased by 23%, and her processing speed by 17%. While not every function returned to her baseline from years earlier, the improvement was sufficient to restore her independence and confidence. Eleanor's experience demonstrates a critical insight about brain health after 65. Even small, consistent interruptions of the fear cycle can produce significant cognitive benefits. The 3-minute protocol works not by eliminating anticipatory fear entirely, but by preventing it from maintaining the constant neurochemical environment that damages vulnerable brain regions. What's particularly valuable about this approach is its accessibility. Unlike many brain health interventions requiring significant time, money, or resources, this simple protocol can be practiced by anyone, anywhere, regardless of physical limitations or cognitive status. It requires no special equipment, no technical knowledge, and minimal time commitment. The key is consistency. Research shows that brief interventions repeated regularly have a stronger neuroprotective effect than longer sessions practiced occasionally. This reflects how the brain actually adapts, through repeated exposure to different neurochemical states rather than occasional intensive experiences. 6 months later, Eleanor, Richard, and Margaret today. 6 months after beginning their respective interventions for fear-driven cognitive decline, Eleanor, Richard, and Margaret have experienced remarkable transformations, not just in brain function, but in their overall approach to aging. I visited Eleanor in her kitchen on a December morning as she was baking her traditional ginger cookies. The same recipe card that had once reduced her to tears now sat on the counter, though she barely glanced at it as she measured and mixed with confidence. "I still have moments of forgetfulness," she acknowledged, cutting star shapes from the rolled dough. "And sometimes the fear creeps back in. But now I recognize it for what it is, and I have tools to keep it from taking over." Eleanor continues her 3-minute protocol daily and has added a weekly watercolor class, which combines creative expression with social connection. Her most recent cognitive assessment showed continued improvement, with some functions now testing at above-average levels for her age group. "My doctor says my case is being used to teach medical students about the impact of emotional states on cognitive aging," she told me with evident pride. "Who would have thought my brain would become a teaching tool at my age?" Richard has expanded his volunteer teaching to include a weekend writing workshop for veterans, combining his professional expertise with meaningful service. "I still notice my memory isn't quite what it was in my 60s, he told me in his book-lined office. But I've stopped catastrophizing every small lapse. The anticipatory fear that was driving my decline has mostly subsided." Richard's cognitive testing now shows age-appropriate function in all domains, with particular strength in verbal reasoning and knowledge application, areas regularly engaged through his teaching. Most significantly, follow-up brain imaging revealed that the hippocampal atrophy observed in his initial scans has stabilized, with some evidence of new neural growth in certain regions. Perhaps most remarkable is Margaret's transformation. Her garden school has expanded to include seniors from a nearby residential facility who join the neighborhood children for intergenerational gardening lessons. "I've stopped focusing on what I might forget," she explained, demonstrating pruning techniques to an attentive 8-year-old. "Instead, I concentrate on what I can still share." Margaret's garden itself has evolved, with new sections designed specifically for teaching and sensory engagement. Plants are grouped to facilitate learning, with clear, hand-painted signs identifying varieties. "I still garden every day," she told me, "but now it's about connection rather than perfection." Her cognitive testing shows significant improvement in both memory and executive function, though some processing speed deficits remain. More importantly, the anticipatory fear that once dominated her thinking has largely resolved, replaced by present-focused engagement. "I'm not afraid of forgetting things anymore," she said. "When it happens, it happens. But it doesn't define me or my future." What unites these three different journeys is a fundamental shift away from fearful anticipation of decline toward engaged participation in the present. This shift isn't merely psychological. It creates measurable changes in brain chemistry, neural connectivity, and cognitive resilience. Their experiences offer powerful hope for anyone concerned about brain health after 65. Cognitive decline isn't always the linear, inevitable process many fear. When the neurological impact of anticipatory fear is addressed, the aging brain demonstrates remarkable capacity for resilience and even recovery. As you consider your own brain health or that of someone you love, remember that the emotional environment in which your brain operates matters profoundly. Small, consistent shifts in how you process anticipatory thoughts can create significant changes in cognitive trajectory. Whether through Eleanor's 3-minute protocol, Richard's purposeful teaching, or Margaret's embodied knowledge sharing, the pathway to protection remains similar. Move from fearful anticipation toward present engagement, from self-focused worry toward meaningful connection, from ruminating on what might be lost toward sharing what remains. Because ultimately, the most powerful protection against fear-driven brain aging isn't found in supplements, brain games, or even advanced medical interventions. It's found in the daily choice to engage fully with life exactly as it is right now, with whatever capabilities currently remain. That choice creates not only better cognitive outcomes but a richer, more meaningful experience of aging itself. Please share your thoughts in the comments if you've experienced something like this. Your story could help someone else realize they're not alone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notified when our next video goes live. We upload fresh, potentially life-saving content daily, and we'd love to have you join our community of health-conscious viewers who are taking control of their well-being.